For 41 years, one of the most celebrated fossils in the history of paleoanthropology sat in a glass case at London's Natural History Museum, presented as the missing link between apes and humans, the earliest known Englishman, proof that the evolutionary story of our species began, of all places, in a gravel pit in the English countryside. Scientists built careers around it, textbooks reproduced it. An entire generation of researchers organized their understanding of human evolution around a skull that, it would eventually turn out, wasn't even a single individual at all, but a human skull glued to the deliberately altered jawbone of an orangutan. This is the story of Piltdown Man, still widely regarded as the longest-running and most consequential fraud in the history of science, not because of who it fooled, though it fooled nearly everyone who mattered, but because of how long it took the scientific community to catch something that, in hindsight, had warning signs built into it from the very first announcement. The story begins in December 1912, at a meeting of the Geological Society of London. Charles Dawson, an amateur archaeologist and practicing solicitor from Sussex, presented what he described as a genuinely extraordinary find. Fragments of a human-like skull, along with an ape-like jawbone, recovered from a gravel pit near the village of Piltdown in East Sussex, alongside a scattering of primitive stone tools and fossilized animal remains that appeared to place the whole assemblage at an extremely ancient age. Dawson had a track record that made the discovery credible on its face. Local newspapers had already nicknamed him the Wizard of Sussex for a string of earlier archaeological finds, including Roman artifacts, medieval relics, and prehistoric tools, and he'd built a genuine reputation as a serious, capable amateur researcher within British archaeological circles. When he approached Arthur Smith Woodward, the respected keeper of geology at the Natural History Museum, with what he described as a fragment of an unusually thick human skull recovered from the Piltdown gravel beds, Woodward took the claim seriously enough to join Dawson at the site directly. Over the following months, the two men, working together, recovered additional skull fragments, the now infamous jawbone, several teeth, and a collection of crude stone and bone tools, all of which they presented as belonging to a single ancient individual. Woodward reconstructed the fragments into a skull that combined an unusually large, essentially modern-looking human brain case with a distinctly ape-like lower jaw, and proposed that the specimen represented a genuinely ancient human ancestor, dating to roughly 500,000 years old. The find was given a formal scientific name, Eoanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's Dawn Man, a naming choice that placed Dawson's own legacy directly and permanently into the heart of the discovery. The timing could not have been more perfect for the claim to land. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was, by 1912, broadly accepted within scientific circles, but the physical fossil evidence connecting early apes to modern humans remained frustratingly sparse. A genuine missing link specimen, one showing an ancient human ancestor with both a large, human-like brain and ape-like jaw features, would fill exactly the gap researchers were most eager to close. And there was a specific national dimension to the excitement as well. Existing hominin fossil discoveries up to that point, including early Neanderthal remains found on the European continent, had all come from outside Britain. Piltdown Man offered British scientists something they'd been notably without, a claim to a genuinely ancient human ancestor discovered on British soil, and one whose large, well-developed brain case seemed to suggest that brain size had evolved ahead of other physical human traits, a conclusion that happened to align comfortably with certain contemporary, and deeply flawed, assumptions about the ranking of human racial groups by supposed cognitive development. Assumptions that were troublingly common in early 20th century anthropology, and that some of Piltdown's most enthusiastic supporters were openly eager to see confirmed. What makes the Piltdown case particularly notable isn't simply that experts were fooled, it's that a meaningful number of them weren't, from very nearly the moment the discovery was first announced. Several prominent anatomists and paleontologists, examining the reconstructed skull and jawbone shortly after Woodward's initial presentation, raised serious anatomical objections almost immediately. The core problem was straightforward. The jawbone looked distinctly, unmistakably ape-like in its proportions, closer to a modern ape's jaw than to anything found in other genuine early human fossils, while the skull fragments looked essentially modern. Combining the two into a single ancient ancestor required treating an ape-like jaw and an essentially modern brain as though they'd evolved together in the same individual, a combination that didn't sit comfortably with what other, less contested fossil evidence was starting to suggest about the actual sequence of human evolutionary development, where jaw and tooth changes and brain size changes appeared to have evolved along a different, more staggered timeline than Piltdown Man implied. Some researchers went considerably further than polite skepticism, proposing outright that Piltdown Man might simply be two entirely separate specimens, an ancient human skull and a genuinely modern ape jawbone that had somehow ended up associated with each other at the same site, whether through accident or deliberate manipulation. That specific, remarkably accurate suspicion was floated within just a few years of the original announcement, decades before it was ultimately confirmed. Despite that early skepticism, Piltdown Man's supporters, chief among them Woodward himself and the American paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, remained forceful and effective advocates for the specimen's authenticity. Osborn in particular threw considerable institutional and personal weight behind defending the find, and the combination of Woodward's credibility within British scientific circles and Osborn's influence within American paleontology was enough to keep Piltdown Man broadly accepted within mainstream scientific consensus for decades, even as a persistent minority of skeptics continued raising doubts in the background. Dawson died in 1916, only 4 years after the initial announcement, and in a detail that later investigators would find genuinely significant, no further Piltdown-type discoveries were ever made again after his death. Despite continued searching at the site and in the surrounding area for years afterward, Woodward remained a committed defender of the specimen's authenticity for the rest of his career, continuing to advocate for Piltdown Man's significance right up until his own death in 1944. Osborn, Piltdown's most influential American champion, had died 9 years earlier, in 1935. With both of its most forceful institutional defenders gone, scientific interest in Piltdown Man gradually began to wane through the 1930s and 1940s, not because anyone had definitively disproven it, but simply because the broader field was moving on. New hominin fossil discoveries were steadily accumulating from Africa, China, and Indonesia. During the same period, genuine early human ancestor remains that fit together into an increasingly coherent, internally consistent picture of human evolutionary history. Piltdown Man, with its awkward, poorly fitting combination of modern skull and ape-like jaw, simply didn't fit cleanly into that emerging picture, and rather than being actively challenged, it was increasingly treated as a curious anomaly, quietly set aside rather than formally investigated. Renewed scientific attention arrived almost by accident in 1953, when Oxford professor of physical anthropology Joseph Weiner struck up a conversation with fellow researcher Kenneth Oakley at a scientific banquet. Weiner couldn't shake the conversation afterward, and began digging back through the accumulated research and available casts of the original Piltdown fossils, examining them with fresh, considerably more skeptical eyes than the specimen had received in years. What he found, on close inspection, was immediately alarming. The teeth recovered from the site, ostensibly ancient fossil teeth, showed wear patterns that looked less like the gradual, irregular wear that accumulates naturally over a lifetime of chewing and more like the kind of deliberate, mechanical wear produced by an abrasive tool. Essentially, the teeth appeared to have been artificially filed down to mimic a natural wear pattern rather than actually developing one. Weiner contacted Oakley, who had direct access to the genuine physical specimens rather than casts, and asked him to examine the teeth under magnification. Oakley agreed. The wear pattern looked deliberately manufactured rather than naturally occurring. That observation kicked off a considerably more rigorous scientific investigation than Piltdown Man had ever previously received. Oakley applied a then relatively new dating technique called fluorine analysis, based on the principle that bones buried in the ground gradually absorb fluoride from surrounding groundwater at a slow, measurable rate. Over time, meaning older bones accumulate more fluoride than younger ones, providing a rough relative age comparison between bones recovered from the same burial site. Applied to the Piltdown specimens, the results were immediately revealing. The skull fragments and the jawbone showed meaningfully different fluoride levels, strongly suggesting the two pieces were not, in fact, the same age at all, undermining the entire premise that they belonged to the same ancient individual. Follow-up analysis went further still. Detailed examination revealed that the supposedly ancient bones and teeth had been artificially stained using chemical treatments to match the distinctive coloring of the surrounding Piltdown gravel deposits, a deliberate effort to make comparatively recent bone material visually convincing as genuinely ancient fossil material. The jawbone itself, once properly re-examined, turned out to belong not to any ancient human ancestor at all, but to a modern orangutan, its jaw and teeth deliberately filed and shaped to disguise its true ape-like proportions and mimic a more human-like wear pattern. The skull fragments, meanwhile, were confirmed to be genuinely human, but far more recent than the claimed 500,000-year age, likely only a few hundred to at most several thousand years old, rather than anything approaching genuine antiquity. On November 21st, 1953, the Natural History Museum formally announced what Oakley and Weiner's investigation had established. Piltdown Man was a fraud, a deliberately assembled composite of a relatively modern human skull and a chemically altered, deliberately filed orangutan jawbone, artificially aged and staged to appear as a single, genuinely ancient fossil discovery. 41 years after its triumphant unveiling, one of the most celebrated fossils in the history of paleoanthropology was exposed as an elaborate, carefully executed hoax. Exposing the hoax and identifying who was actually responsible for it turned out to be two very different problems, and the second one took considerably longer to resolve. The most obvious suspect was Charles Dawson himself, the amateur archaeologist who had originally brought the specimens forward and who had personally been present for nearly every subsequent Piltdown find over the following years. But Dawson wasn't the only person present at various stages of the discovery, and over the decades following the 1953 exposure, a genuinely wide range of alternative suspects were proposed, seriously investigated, and argued over by different researchers. Arthur Smith Woodward himself came under suspicion. Given his central involvement, though most researchers ultimately concluded he was more likely an unwitting participant guided by Dawson than an active co-conspirator. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit priest and paleontologist who had assisted with portions of the excavation work, was seriously proposed as a possible culprit by several later researchers. Martin Hinton, a volunteer who worked alongside Woodward at the museum, was another genuine suspect, based partly on the later discovery of a trunk bearing his initials, containing bones stained in a manner similar to the Piltdown specimens. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, who lived near the Piltdown site and had some tangential connection to the individuals involved, was seriously floated as a possible suspect at various points, based largely on his geographic proximity and personal interest in matters of scientific mystery, though never with anything approaching solid supporting evidence. The question of sole versus collaborative responsibility remained genuinely unresolved for over 60 years after the initial exposure, until a comprehensive scientific review published in 2016, led by researcher Isabelle de Groot, applied modern forensic and genetic analysis techniques to the surviving Piltdown material. That analysis found that all of the forged specimens appeared to have been produced using a single, consistent set of materials and techniques, evidence strongly suggesting a single individual working alone was responsible for the entire fabrication, rather than a coordinated group effort involving multiple collaborators. Combined with a broader review of the circumstantial evidence built up over decades, the 2016 study concluded that Charles Dawson was very likely solely responsible for the fraud. Archaeologist Miles Russell, who had separately argued for Dawson's sole responsibility in a detailed 2012 book examining the case, pointed out that a genuine multi-person conspiracy would have carried serious practical risks for Dawson himself, since any accomplice would have represented a permanent, ongoing risk of blackmail or eventual public exposure. A hoax orchestrated and executed by one person alone, keeping the full scope of the deception genuinely private, was, from a purely practical standpoint, considerably safer for whoever was actually responsible. Motive, meanwhile, appeared straightforward. Researchers examining Dawson's broader career found a documented pattern of exaggerated or outright fabricated claims across a number of his other archaeological finds throughout his career, well beyond Piltdown alone, suggesting a long-standing, genuine pursuit of professional recognition and scientific status that Piltdown Man, spectacularly, and for over 4 decades, actually delivered. The most genuinely unsettling aspect of the Piltdown story isn't really that a hoax was pulled off successfully. Elaborate scientific frauds have happened before and since. It's the sheer length of time this particular one survived, broadly accepted within mainstream scientific consensus, despite clear anatomical objections having been raised almost immediately after the initial announcement. Several factors converged to make that unusually long survival possible. Institutional authority mattered enormously. Woodward's standing at the Natural History Museum and Osborne's influence within American paleontology gave the specimen a level of institutional backing that made sustained, forceful skepticism professionally risky for other researchers, particularly less established ones, to pursue too aggressively. Confirmation bias played a significant role too. Piltdown Man arrived at a moment when British scientists were genuinely eager for a homegrown missing link discovery, and when certain existing, deeply flawed assumptions about brain development and human evolutionary sequencing made a large-brained, ape-jawed ancient human ancestor a conveniently satisfying answer to a question many researchers were already inclined to want answered a particular way. There was also simply a technological gap. The fluorine dating technique that ultimately helped crack the case wasn't available in any practical, widely accessible form back in 1912 or for a considerable stretch of the following decades. Without a reliable independent method for directly comparing the relative ages of the skull and jawbone fragments, researchers were left relying primarily on anatomical judgment and visual inspection. Methods that, however carefully applied, proved genuinely insufficient to definitively settle the question one way or the other for over 4 decades. It's a sobering illustration of how a scientific claim's survival can end up depending less on the underlying strength of the evidence supporting it, and more on whether the specific analytical tools required to properly test it have actually been invented yet. Piltdown Man's most direct damage was to the field of paleoanthropology itself. For over 4 decades, researchers working in human evolutionary studies had to account for, or actively work around, a supposedly genuine fossil specimen that simply didn't fit coherently with the rest of the accumulating fossil evidence. Some researchers spent real portions of their careers trying to reconcile Piltdown Man's awkward combination of features with other, genuine discoveries, effort that, in hindsight, was being spent entirely in service of a fabrication. The reputational damage extended well beyond the scientists who had actively championed the find. The case became, and remains, a genuinely standard cautionary reference point used across multiple scientific disciplines, not just paleoanthropology, as a specific, well-documented illustration of how institutional authority, motivated reasoning, and a genuine absence of adequate verification tools can combine to let a fabrication survive far longer than the underlying evidence, properly scrutinized, would ever have supported on its own. There's also a more uncomfortable dimension to the story worth naming directly. Piltdown Man's supposed evidence for early disproportionate human brain development was actively used. During the decades it was accepted to support deeply flawed and racially prejudiced theories about the separate, unequal evolutionary development of different human population groups, theories that a genuine, unbiased reading of the fossil record never actually supported in the first place, but that Piltdown's specific combination of features happened to lend superficial, convenient credibility to for exactly the researchers most eager to hear it. Once investigators knew to look for fabrication rather than assuming authenticity, the physical construction of the Piltdown specimens turned out to be a genuinely elaborate, carefully considered piece of deception, worth walking through in some detail simply to appreciate how much deliberate effort went into it. The skull fragments were, as later analysis confirmed, genuinely human, but the forger had selected an unusually thick-boned specimen and broken it in a manner specifically designed to obscure the kind of sutures and structural details that a trained anatomist would normally use to estimate age and identify modern versus ancient origin. The jawbone, taken from an orangutan, required considerably more work to disguise convincingly. The forger had deliberately broken off the sections of the jaw, specifically the areas where it would have connected to the skull, that would have most clearly revealed its non-human origin under close inspection, leaving behind only the portions that could plausibly be interpreted as ambiguous or transitional in form. The teeth, as Weiner had first suspected, had been carefully filed down using an abrasive tool to remove their naturally ape-like shape and produce a flattened wear pattern that superficially resembled the kind of gradual wear seen in genuine ancient human teeth, worn down through decades of a very different diet and chewing pattern than an orangutan's teeth would naturally show. Beyond the bones themselves, the forger had gone to considerable additional lengths to make the surrounding physical context convincing. The bones and teeth had been chemically treated with iron compounds, specifically to produce the reddish-brown staining characteristic of the local Piltdown gravel deposits, a deliberate visual match designed to make freshly altered material look as though it had genuinely been buried in that specific soil for hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools recovered from the same site, presented as evidence of the associated ancient culture that supposedly produced and used them, were later determined to be either genuine ancient tools imported from elsewhere and deliberately planted at the Piltdown site, or crude modern imitations manufactured specifically to support the broader narrative. Even the animal fossils recovered from the same gravel layers, presented as contemporary evidence supporting the site's claimed antiquity, appear to have been sourced from other locations entirely and deliberately introduced to Piltdown to reinforce the overall impression of a genuinely ancient, undisturbed archaeological deposit. Taken together, this wasn't a hastily assembled prank or a single lucky fabrication that happened to fool people. It was a sustained, technically sophisticated deception, requiring genuine knowledge of comparative anatomy, chemistry, and geology, executed patiently over multiple years and multiple separate discoveries, each carefully timed to sustain ongoing scientific interest and gradually build the specimen's credibility rather than presenting everything at once in a way that might have invited more immediate, concentrated scrutiny. Piltdown's place among scientific frauds. Piltdown Man isn't the only significant fraud in the history of science, and it's worth briefly placing it in that broader context to understand exactly what makes it stand out as the case most commonly invoked as science's biggest scandal, rather than simply one entry among many. Scientific history includes a number of other well-documented cases of fabricated or manipulated research, from individually falsified data sets in modern biomedical research to entire fabricated experimental results in physics and chemistry. What distinguishes Piltdown from most of these other cases is a specific combination of factors. The sheer duration of the deception, 41 years, considerably longer than almost any other major scientific fraud has managed to survive once seriously investigated. The significance of the field it distorted, directly touching the scientific understanding of human origins and evolutionary history, a subject with obvious and immediate cultural resonance well beyond specialist academic circles. And the fact that its ultimate resolution came not from a whistleblower or an internal confession, but from patient, methodical forensic science conducted decades after the fact, using techniques the original perpetrator could never have anticipated. That combination, extraordinary duration, high public and scientific stakes, and an eventual resolution driven by technological advancement rather than a moral reckoning from anyone directly involved, is largely why Piltdown Man has remained the default reference point invoked whenever the phrase biggest scandal in science comes up, even in conversations about far more recent instances of scientific misconduct. It's not necessarily that Piltdown caused more direct harm than every other scientific fraud in history. Arguably, several more recent cases involving falsified medical research have caused more direct, measurable harm to real people, but it remains uniquely emblematic of just how long a well-constructed deception can survive inside a field that, in principle, is specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of error. More than 70 years after the hoax was finally exposed, Piltdown Man continues to occupy a genuinely unusual position within the culture of science itself, invoked constantly not as a historical footnote, but as an active, ongoing reference point. Within paleoanthropology specifically, the case permanently reshaped how new hominin fossil discoveries are handled and verified. Modern practice for any major new human ancestor fossil find now typically involves multiple independent research teams, working with different analytical techniques before a finding is broadly accepted into mainstream scientific consensus, a direct, if informal, institutional response to exactly the kind of single-source, single-institution acceptance that allowed Piltdown to survive challenge for so long. Dating techniques considerably more precise and reliable than the fluorine analysis that finally cracked the case, including radiometric and isotope-based methods, are now standard practice for verifying the age of any significant new fossil discovery before it's presented to the wider scientific community, specifically closing the exact technological gap that allowed Piltdown's contradictions to go unresolved for over 4 decades. Beyond the specific field it originally distorted, Piltdown Man has become a genuinely widely used shorthand across science education more broadly, taught specifically as a case study in scientific skepticism, the importance of independent verification, and the ways institutional authority and motivated reasoning can combine to sustain a false conclusion well past the point where the underlying evidence should have overturned it. It's referenced in psychology and philosophy of science coursework discussing confirmation bias, in journalism, ethics discussions about verifying extraordinary claims, and in general science communication as a touchstone example whenever a new, potentially too good to be true finding surfaces, and researchers want a shared historical reference point for appropriate caution. The case has also produced a lasting cultural footprint well outside academic science itself. It's been the subject of documentaries, popular books, and dramatic stage productions, exploring the mystery of who was actually responsible. A mystery that notably remained genuinely unresolved for over 60 years after the fraud itself was exposed, almost as long as the original deception had managed to survive undetected in the first place. That double mystery, first how the hoax fooled the scientific establishment for 4 decades, and then who had actually done it, sustained for another 6 decades beyond that, is a significant part of why the story has retained this level of ongoing public fascination rather than fading into a purely academic footnote. It would be a mistake to read the Piltdown Man story as evidence that science, as a method, doesn't work or can't be trusted. If anything, the case demonstrates precisely the opposite, played out over an unusually long and uncomfortable timeline. The hoax was, eventually, definitively caught, and it was caught using exactly the kind of rigorous, independently verifiable scientific method. In this specific case, fluorine dating combined with detailed physical and chemical re-examination that the field lacked at the moment the fraud was first perpetrated. Science didn't fail permanently here. It failed for 41 years, and then it corrected itself, decisively and completely, once the right tools and the right degree of renewed scrutiny were finally applied. What the case does illustrate, clearly and usefully, is that scientific consensus is never automatically self-correcting on any particular timeline just because it's built on a methodology that is, in principle, self-correcting. Correction requires someone to actually look again, ideally with better tools than were available the first time. And it requires a research culture willing to seriously entertain the possibility that a celebrated institutionally defended finding might simply be wrong, or worse, might be an outright fabrication. Piltdown Man survived as long as it did, partly because the specific people with the standing to seriously challenge it had strong professional and personal incentives not to, and partly because the technology required to settle the question definitively simply hadn't been invented yet. Modern science has, in the decades since, developed considerably more robust systems specifically aimed at catching this kind of fraud faster. Peer review processes that, while imperfect, are more rigorous than what existed in 1912. A far broader base of independent research groups capable of cross-checking major claims against each other, and dramatically more powerful analytical techniques, genetic sequencing, isotope dating, high-resolution imaging, that simply didn't exist for most of the 20th century. Piltdown Man couldn't have survived nearly as long today, not because scientists have become less susceptible to bias or wishful thinking, but because the tools now available to actually test an extraordinary claim quickly, independently, and definitively are so much better than what Weiner and Oakley had to work with in 1953, let alone what anyone had access to back in 1912. The scandal endures specifically as a reminder of exactly what those tools and that culture of renewed scrutiny are actually for.